New Zealand has a unique pattern of land use, with about 80% of its land being uninhabited. Most of the population is concentrated in the North Island, where over 75% of people live, and nearly half of them are in the biggest city, Auckland. Auckland sits on a perfect spot on an isthmus, with great natural harbours on both sides and pretty fertile volcanic soil. These factors have made Auckland the economic and population centre of New Zealand, with almost 2 million people living there now. That's about 37% of the country's population. This super-concentrated population distribution makes New Zealand one of the most urbanised developed countries in the world. The way people are spread out in New Zealand has been heavily shaped by its history. From the first humans settling there to European colonists arriving, and then to modern society forming. All these historical factors have worked together to create how New Zealand's population is distributed today. As one of the last major landmasses humans discovered and settled, New Zealand's first residents were the Polynesian people, who later became known as the Maori. They came to New Zealand by canoe across the Pacific around the 13th century and became the original inhabitants. The Maori mostly settled in the North Island because it was warmer and had better soil for farming and hunting. This early choice laid the groundwork for the North Island becoming the population centre later on. By the 18th century, European colonists started coming to New Zealand, bringing modern technology and social systems with them. At first, these colonists were more interested in the South Island for two main reasons. First, the natural resources, especially the discovery of gold, which sparked a gold rush in the late 19th century. Second, there were fewer Maori people in the South Island, so European colonists faced less conflict and competition when settling there, making it easier to develop and control. The South Island briefly became New Zealand's economic centre, with cities like Christchurch and Dunedin growing quickly and attracting lots of immigrants and workers. However, this population pattern changed big time as years went by. As the South Island's gold mines started running dry, the economic centre began shifting to the North Island. The North Island not only had better natural conditions for long-term development, but cities like Auckland were also becoming important trade and transportation hubs. At the same time, the relationship between Maori people and European settlers was changing. As colonization expanded, many Maori were forced to move, especially during land disputes, when some were pushed out of the North Island's central areas. Even so, Maori culture remained centered in the North Island, which further strengthened the North Island's high population density. New Zealand's location has really affected how its population is spread out. As one of the most remote countries in the world, New Zealand is surrounded by vast oceans, with even its closest neighbour, Australia, being 2,000 kilometres away. This isolation has historically limited both the number and speed of immigrants coming in, and has somewhat influenced how concentrated the population is. Because of this geographical isolation, New Zealand's first settlements were usually along the coast, especially near natural harbours. Port cities became population centres because of their convenient sea transportation. For example, Auckland and Wellington developed into densely populated cities thanks to their great locations and transportation connections. This pattern still has a big impact today because modern economic activities and transportation systems mostly rely on these coastal areas. Plus, inland areas and places far from major cities have much lower population density because they're harder to get to and more cut off from the outside world. The South Island's inland areas, rugged mountains, and some remote rural areas have always had few people living in them. This sparse population directly shows how geographical isolation limits human activity. However, geographical isolation hasn't completely stopped development. In New Zealand, as modern technology has improved and transportation has gotten better, some remote areas have seen population growth, especially driven by tourism. Famous natural attractions like Queenstown and Franz Josef Glacier in the South Island, while geographically remote, attract tourists from around the world, which has indirectly led to more people settling there and growth in the service industry. New Zealand's economic structure has deeply influenced where people live. Because of its geographical features and available resources, New Zealand's economy heavily depends on agriculture, especially pastoral farming. This economic model has determined both how the land is used and how people move and gather. New Zealand has limited arable land, which has made extensive grazing the main form of agriculture, particularly sheep farming. Currently, New Zealand has about 27 million sheep, but only 5 million people. This way of production means agricultural activities are more concentrated in sparsely populated rural areas, especially in the South Island. The South Island's vast grasslands and suitable climate provide an ideal environment for livestock farming, which is why the South Island's population is more spread out, with a higher proportion of agricultural workers. However, this economic model has also led to some changes in population distribution. As farming became more mechanized and larger in scale, traditional agriculture needed fewer workers, and many rural people started moving to cities looking for more job opportunities. This trend was especially noticeable in the mid to late 20th century, particularly in the North Island, where people increasingly concentrated in cities like Auckland and Wellington. Also, since New Zealand lacks profitable natural resources like oil and minerals, its economy gradually shifted towards exporting animal products like wool, dairy products, and meat. This export-oriented economy made coastal cities centers for trade and processing, which further attracted people to these areas. For example, Auckland, as New Zealand's largest port and economic center, has attracted lots of people and investment thanks to its great location and developed transportation network. In contrast, inland areas of the South Island have seen slow population growth or even decline in some places because of their limited economic activities. New Zealand's terrain has had a huge impact on where people live, especially in the South Island. The complex terrain and the Southern Alps have really limited where people can gather and develop economically. The Southern Alps run lengthwise through the South Island, with their highest peak being over 3,700 meters, about as tall as Japan's Mount Fuji. These mountains not only take up a lot of land, but also significantly affect the climate. The Southern Alps create a really uneven rainfall pattern in the South Island. Because the prevailing westerly winds blow in from the Tasman Sea, the western side of the mountains gets lots of rain, making the coastal areas wet and rainy. On the flip side, the eastern side becomes dry, because the winds lose their moisture after crossing the mountains, creating a rain shadow where large plains are often in drought. These climate conditions are really bad for farming. They can't guarantee stable water supply and make it hard to grow crops extensively. In comparison, the North Island's terrain is gentler, without huge obstacles like the Southern Alps. While the North Island does have active volcanoes, these volcanoes have actually made some areas more fertile over time with volcanic soil, which is good for farming. Also, rainfall is more evenly distributed in the North Island without obvious rain shadows, and the climate is generally better for people to live and develop in. Being closer to the equator, the North Island is warmer with higher average temperatures, which makes it even more attractive for people to live there. While New Zealand's temperate climate is great for human life, the soil fertility limits farming and affects where people live. Even though New Zealand's climate is similar to Britain's, with even rainfall and moderate temperatures, some areas have poor soil fertility because there hasn't been much volcanic activity. These soil conditions make farming challenging, so people tend to concentrate in areas with more productive land. Some parts of the North Island have fertile soil from volcanic ash deposits, making them core agricultural areas that attract more settlers. For example, the Waikato region is famous for its fertile pastures and is an important dairy production base in New Zealand. In contrast, many areas in the South Island, especially the rugged highlands and the eastern plains with lower soil fertility, have much lower population density. In recent years, New Zealand's population growth has mainly been driven by immigration, which has become a key factor in its social makeup and population changes. Currently, over 27% of New Zealand's population was born overseas. That's way higher than many other countries and shows their open and diverse immigration policy. Recently, where immigrants come from has changed a lot. Besides traditional immigrants from Britain and Europe, more and more people are coming from Asian countries like China, India, and the Philippines. These immigrants bring diverse cultures, languages, and skills, and add energy to New Zealand's job market. They're especially important in filling job gaps in key areas like technology, healthcare, and service industries. Compared to European and American countries, New Zealand's population density is really sparse. New Zealand's total area is about 268,000 square kilometers, similar to Britain, but there's a huge difference in population size. Britain has about 69 million people, almost 14 times New Zealand's 5 million. This gap shows up not just in total population, but also in how people live and how resources are distributed. In Europe and North America, many countries have people highly concentrated in big cities and surrounding areas because of their industrial history. For example, core cities like Berlin in Germany and Paris in France have way higher population density than Auckland, New Zealand's most densely populated city. In contrast, New Zealand's urbanization happened later. Lots of land is still undeveloped, and rural areas and nature reserves take up a big part of the country, which makes the population more spread out. New Zealand's much lower population density compared to European and American countries shows both its unique geographical, historical, and economic development conditions, and is a core feature of its social and ecological model. Low population density means rich natural resources and a good environment, giving residents a high quality of life, but it also creates challenges for economic development, infrastructure building, and international competitiveness.